What if the next person you helped wasn't human? Tonight, we're traveling to Sri Lanka, a breathtaking island of lush jungles, ancient ruins, and vibrant culture. But behind its beauty lies something far darker, a legend that has terrified locals for generations. They call her Mohini, a ghostly figure said to appear on empty roads late at night, dressed in a pure white sari, holding what looks like a helpless infant. She seems lost, vulnerable, desperate for help, and that's exactly how she traps you. Because the moment you stop, the moment you reach out, you realize the child in her arms isn't a child at all, and by then, it's already too late. In Sri Lankan folklore, countless people have vanished after encountering her, and even today, locals refuse to travel certain roads after midnight, no matter the reason. So stick with me until the end, because I'm not just going to tell you the stories. I'm going to break down the chilling cultural roots behind the Mohini legend and why fear of her still shapes real behavior to this day. And if you're into dark folklore, real mysteries, and stories that stay with you long after the video ends, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Our first account takes us to the outskirts of Kandy, a city nestled in the central highlands of Sri Lanka, surrounded by dense forests and winding mountain roads. It was the monsoon season of 2018, and the rain had been pouring relentlessly for 3 days straight. Amila, a 32-year-old three-wheeler driver, was working the late shift. Driving a tuk-tuk in the pouring rain is a grueling task. The canvas flaps of his vehicle did little to keep the biting wind and the damp chill out, and the narrow, winding roads were slick with mud and fallen leaves. Around 1 a.m, Amila dropped off his final passenger of the night at a remote village on the edge of the Nuwara Eliya sanctuary, a historic forest reserve known for its dense canopy and eerie, profound silence. Exhausted and eager to get back to his warm bed, Amila decided to take a notorious shortcut through a secondary road that skirted the very edge of the forest. The locals usually avoided this road after dark. It was completely unlit, flanked by towering mahogany and teak trees whose branches formed a suffocating tunnel overhead. But the heavy rain and his own fatigue pushed Amila to ignore the old superstitions. He turned his three-wheeler onto the narrow asphalt, the dim yellow beam of his single headlight struggling to pierce the thick curtain of rain. The only sounds were the sputtering of his two-stroke engine and the rhythmic, aggressive drumming of the rain against the metal roof. About 10 minutes into the shortcut, the engine began to struggle, whining as it climbed a particularly steep incline. As the vehicle crested the hill, Amila saw something that made him instinctively slam on the brakes, sending the three-wheeler into a slight skid before coming to a halt. Standing on the left shoulder of the road, barely illuminated by the edge of his headlight, was a woman. She was dressed in a traditional white sari, the fabric clinging to her frame, completely soaked from the torrential downpour. Her long black hair was plastered to her face, obscuring her features, and in her arms she was cradling a small bundle wrapped in a thick, dark blanket. Amila felt a sudden, deep drop in his stomach. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to hit the gas and drive away. He knew the stories. Every driver in Kandy knew the stories of the woman in white. But as he sat there, his engine idling loudly in the dark, the woman slowly raised her head. He still could not make out her face, but he saw her gently rock the bundle in her arms. A wave of overwhelming guilt washed over him. What if this was just a desperate mother whose child was terribly sick? The nearest hospital was miles away, and out here, in this storm, they could both freeze to death. Pushing his fear aside, Amila leaned over and unzipped the canvas flap on the passenger side. He called out to her over the noise of the engine, asking where she needed to go. The woman did not speak. She simply glided toward the vehicle with a strange, smooth motion that seemed entirely disconnected from the uneven, muddy ground beneath her feet. She climbed into the back seat of the three-wheeler without a single word. Amila asked her again if she was heading to the general hospital, but he was met with absolute silence. Assuming she was simply in shock or paralyzed by the cold, he put the vehicle into gear and accelerated down the dark road. Almost immediately, the atmosphere inside the small cabin changed. The damp, earthy smell of the rain was suddenly overpowered by an overwhelming, suffocating scent of crushed jasmine flowers mixed with something deeply unpleasant, like stagnant water or rotting meat. The temperature plummeted. Amila could see his own breath misting in the air in front of him. He glanced up at his small rearview mirror, hoping to check on his passenger, but the angle was wrong and the back seat was swallowed by shadows. He tried to make small talk to ease his own growing panic, mentioning the terrible weather and assuring her they would be in the city soon. Still, there was no response. But then, over the roar of the engine and the splashing of the tires, Amila heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a low, rhythmic humming, a lullaby. The melody was ancient, entirely unfamiliar to him, and it was being sung in a raspy, guttural voice that did not sound like it could belong to a young woman. It sounded like two stones grinding together. Amila's hands gripped the handlebars so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked into the rearview mirror again, adjusting it slightly with trembling fingers. What he saw in the reflection defied all logic. The back seat was completely empty. There was no woman, there was no baby. But the heavy scent of jasmine and decay was stronger than ever, and the raspy humming was now right beside his ear, as if someone was leaning over his shoulder from the empty space behind him. Panic overtook him. He turned his head sharply to look behind him, taking his eyes off the road for just the fraction of a second. In that instant, a pale, decaying hand with unnaturally long, dirt-caked fingernails reached out from the darkness and rested gently on his shoulder. Amila screamed and jerked the handlebars instinctively. The three-wheeler veered off the slick asphalt, crashing violently into the thick trunk of a jackfruit tree. When Amila regained consciousness, the rain had stopped and the pale light of dawn was filtering through the trees. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, and his vehicle was heavily damaged. A passing milk delivery truck eventually found him and took him to the hospital. When the police investigated the crash site, they found no trace of a woman, no footprints in the mud, and no signs of another passenger. Amila survived, but he quit driving that very week. To this day, he refuses to be alone in the dark, because whenever the air grows cold and the scent of jasmine fills a room, he can still feel the weight of that decaying hand resting on his shoulder, waiting for him to turn around. Our next story takes us away from the bustling streets of Kandy and higher up into the freezing, mist-covered mountains of Nuwara Eliya. Known as Little England due to its colonial-era bungalows and endless rolling tea estates, this region is famous for its breathtaking beauty and its bitter, bone-chilling cold. But the sprawling tea plantations, with their narrow footpaths and isolated factories, hold a deep sense of isolation that can play tricks on the human mind. Roshan was a 26-year-old assistant estate manager who had just been transferred to a remote tea plantation in the high country. He was an ambitious man, eager to prove himself, which often meant working late into the night at the estate's processing factory, overseeing the drying and sorting of the tea leaves. His accommodation was a sprawling, century-old colonial bungalow situated about a mile away from the factory, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound its way through the dense, waist-high tea bushes. It was a Tuesday night in late November, a time of year when the mountain mist rolls in thick and heavy, swallowing entire landscapes in a matter of minutes. Roshan had stayed at the factory until nearly 1 in the morning to finish a backlog of paperwork. When he finally stepped out into the freezing night air, the mist was so dense he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He zipped up his heavy jacket, grabbed his flashlight, and began the long walk back to his bungalow. The absolute silence of the tea estate was oppressive. There were no crickets, no wind, just the crunch of his own boots on the gravel path. About halfway to his bungalow, the path curved around a small, ancient weighing station, a simple wooden structure used by the tea pluckers during the day. As Roshan approached the curve, his flashlight beam caught something white standing near the wooden posts. He stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. Through the swirling gray mist, he could make out the silhouette of a woman. She was wearing a white sari, her back turned to him, her head bowed. Roshan's first thought was one of confusion and anger. It was strictly against estate rules for any of the workers to be out in the fields this late at night, especially in such freezing temperatures. He took a few steps forward, intending to reprimand her and tell her to get back to the workers' lines. But as he drew closer, he heard a sound that made him hesitate. She was crying. It was a soft, desperate sobbing that cut through the silence of the night. He lowered his flashlight so as not to blind her and called out softly, asking what was wrong and why she was out here. The woman slowly turned around. Roshan felt a strange sense of disorientation. Her face was beautiful, but it was incredibly pale, almost translucent in the dim light, and her eyes were dark, hollow voids that seemed to pull the light into them. In her arms, she held a large bundle wrapped in a tattered, dirty cloth. She spoke to him in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, begging him for help. She told him that her baby was freezing, that she had a stone in her shoe and needed to adjust her clothing, but she could not put the child down on the wet, freezing ground. She held the bundle out toward him, her dark eyes pleading. Roshan was a rational man, highly educated and entirely dismissive of the local ghost stories the estate workers whispered about. He saw a mother in distress. He stepped forward, putting his flashlight under his arm, and reached out to take the child. The moment the bundle was placed into his hands, Roshan knew something was terribly wrong. It was unbelievably heavy, feeling more like a sack of wet stones than a human infant, and it was freezing. A deep, unnatural cold seeped through the tattered cloth, biting into his hands and sending a violent shiver up his arms. He looked down at the bundle, confused by the weight and the utter lack of movement. There was no breathing, no warmth, no sound. He looked back up to ask the woman what was wrapped in the cloth, but the space in front of him was entirely empty. The woman in the white sari had vanished. There were no footsteps retreating into the tea bushes, no rustling of branches. She was simply gone. Panic seized Roshan's chest. He looked back down at the heavy bundle in his arms. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he pulled back the edge of the tattered cloth. Inside, there was no baby. There was only a large, smooth river stone, covered in dark, dried blood, and a thick tangle of long, black human hair. Roshan dropped the stone in horror, stumbling backward and falling onto the gravel path. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his flashlight, and ran blindly toward his bungalow, the beam of light bouncing wildly through the mist. He did not stop running until he reached his front door, fumbled with his keys, and locked himself inside. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his living room, a cricket bat in his hands, staring at the front door. The next morning, in the bright light of day, Roshan convinced himself that the exhaustion and the isolation of the mountains had caused him to hallucinate. He walked back to the weighing station, expecting to find nothing, but sitting exactly where he had dropped it was the large, blood-stained river stone, wrapped in a tattered piece of white fabric. Roshan requested a transfer back to Colombo that very same day. He left the mountains behind, but the psychological toll never truly left him. To this day, he cannot hold anything heavy in his arms without feeling that sudden, biting cold, and he refuses to look out windows when the fog rolls in, terrified of seeing that pale, beautiful face staring back at him from the mist. While the mountains hold their own deep secrets, the long, desolate highways of Sri Lanka's dry zone offer a completely different kind of isolation. This brings us to our final account, which takes place on the endless, straight roads that connect the capital city of Colombo to the ancient ruins of Anuradhapura. These roads cut straight through dense, unforgiving jungles and sprawling scrublands, where the heat of the day gives way to an oppressive, heavy humidity at night. Sajith was a 21-year-old university student who made the long journey home to Anuradhapura on his motorcycle every few months. He preferred riding at night to avoid the blistering daytime sun and the chaotic traffic of buses and lorries. It was a clear, moonless night in April. Sajith had been riding for over 3 hours, the monotonous hum of his motorcycle engine and the endless ribbon of black asphalt lulling him into a state of highway hypnosis. The only light came from his headlamp, creating a narrow tunnel of visibility surrounded by a wall of impenetrable darkness. Around 2 a.m, Sajith entered a particularly desolate stretch of road that passed through a dense wildlife reserve. There were no streetlights, no houses, and no other vehicles, just the towering silhouettes of ancient trees flanking the road. As he navigated a gentle curve, his headlight illuminated a figure walking on the left shoulder of the road, heading in the same direction he was traveling. As he approached, he saw it was a woman dressed in a white sari. This was highly unusual. Villages in this area were miles apart, and the jungle was home to wild elephants and leopards. No one in their right mind would be walking alone out here at this hour. Sajith slowed his motorcycle slightly as he passed her. He glanced to his left, expecting her to turn and ask for a ride, but she did not even acknowledge him. She just kept walking, her head bowed, cradling something small against her chest. Sajith felt a brief pang of concern, but the survival instinct of a solo rider kicked in. He accelerated, leaving her behind in the darkness, rationalizing that she must live in a nearby settlement he could not see from the road. He rode for another 10 minutes, covering several miles at a high speed. The encounter had unsettled him, but he focused on the road ahead. Then, as his headlight swept across a long straightaway, he saw her again. Walking on the left shoulder, the exact same woman, in the exact same white sari, holding the exact same bundle. Sajith's heart hammered against his ribs. It was impossible. He had been traveling at over 60 kilometers an hour. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of him. He convinced himself his tired mind was playing tricks on him, that it was just another local woman dressed similarly. He twisted the throttle, speeding up, passing her in a blur of motion. This time, he did not look at her. He just wanted to get out of the jungle. 5 minutes later, the temperature of the humid night air suddenly dropped, turning icy cold. A thick, unnatural fog began to seep out from the jungle, rolling across the asphalt and reducing his visibility to almost nothing. Sajith was forced to slow down to a crawl, navigating purely by the white line painted on the center of the road. Then, a figure materialized out of the fog directly in the middle of his lane. Sajith slammed on his brakes, the motorcycle fishtailing violently before coming to a stop just a few feet away from the figure. It was her, the woman in the white sari. But she was no longer walking away. She was standing perfectly still, facing him. Sajith's engine idled, the headlight casting harsh, long shadows across her body. She slowly raised her head. Her face was hidden behind a veil of tangled black hair, but her mouth was visible, twisted into a horrifying, unnaturally wide smile that revealed rows of sharp, jagged teeth. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the motorcycle. Sajith was paralyzed. His brain screamed at him to drop the bike and run, to put it in gear and drive around her, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in a state of absolute, primal terror. The woman approached until she was standing right beside his front wheel. She extended her arms, offering him the bundle she was carrying. The cloth fell away, but there was no baby inside. Instead, it was a writhing, pulsing mass of dark shadows and rotting vegetation, reeking of damp earth and decay. She leaned in close, her breath freezing against his face, and whispered in a voice that echoed inside his own head, asking him to take her child. Suddenly, the blaring, deafening horn of a massive cargo lorry shattered the silence. The blinding high beams of the truck pierced through the fog from behind Sajith, bathing the road in intense light. The sudden noise and light broke the paralysis. Sajith snapped out of his trance, kicked the motorcycle into gear, swerved violently around the spot where the woman was standing, and sped off into the night, trailing behind the massive lorry for protection all the way to the city limits. When he finally arrived home, he collapsed in his driveway, shaking uncontrollably. He never rode his motorcycle at night again, but the terror did not end on that lonely jungle road. Now, whenever Sajith sits alone in a quiet room, or whenever he drives his car down a dark street, he occasionally feels a sudden, icy chill on the back of his neck. He feels the unmistakable sensation of someone sitting right behind him, and he can hear the faint, rustling whisper of a woman patiently asking him to take her child. And he knows, deep down, that she is still waiting for an answer. So, what is the truth behind the terrifying legend of Mohini? If we look closely at the cultural and historical context of Sri Lanka and the broader South Asian region, the white sari is deeply symbolic. In many of these cultures, white is the color of mourning, worn by widows and at funerals. The folklore of a woman in white carrying a child is often rooted in the historical tragedies of maternal mortality. Centuries ago, women who died in childbirth or mothers who lost their infants to disease were believed to be bound to the earth by their overwhelming grief and unfulfilled maternal instincts. They become vengeful spirits, trapped in a cycle of searching for their lost children or seeking to inflict their pain onto the living. The entity of Mohini serves as a dark cautionary tale, a manifestation of the dangers that lurk in the untamed wilderness and the vulnerable hours of the night, specifically targeting solitary male travelers. However, if we look at these encounters through a purely rational and scientific lens, there are several logical explanations. The environments where these sightings occur, dense forests, high-altitude tea estates, and monotonous jungle highways, are prime locations for extreme sensory deprivation and psychological stress. For drivers like Amila and Sajith, the phenomenon of highway hypnosis and microsleeps can cause vivid, terrifying waking dreams. When the brain is starved of stimulation on a dark, repetitive road, it begins to invent shapes and figures out of shadows and mist to keep itself alert. This is known as pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces and human forms in ambiguous stimuli. In Roshan's case, the extreme isolation of the tea estate, combined with the freezing temperatures and the thick fog, could easily distort reality. The heavy stone he found may have just been a stone, and the weeping woman a trick of the mist and his own exhaustion. But does a rational explanation truly erase the fear? When you are alone in the dark, miles from civilization, and the air suddenly turns freezing cold. Do you trust your logic, or do you trust your instincts? If a woman steps out of the shadows and begs you for help, will you keep driving, or will you stop? What do you think happened? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true ghost stories from across Asia.